Our story begins about 9,000 years ago in the Aegean. Mobile groups of hunters, fishers and gatherers had used the sea for millennia for raw materials and resource procurement. The first colonists introduced new lifestyle of the Neolithic revolution to the Aegean region via different routes. New excavations in western Turkey verified that these pioneers arrived in western Anatolia from the east around 6700 BC via land and sea routes. Even if the islands of the Aegean remained unsettled for another 4,000 years, the sea forms the decisive cultural space between the Orient and Europe. A previously unknown settlement mound sheds light on many unanswered research questions. The site is located on the central Aegean coast of western Turkey, opposite the Greek island of Samos. An inconspicuous mound located between the modern town of Selçuk and the ancient metropolis of Ephesus is the starting point of our investigations. Long before the founding of Ephesus, the mound of Çukuriçi was a prehistoric center. Nowadays, the mound is situated in a fruitful plain surrounded by agricultural fields about 7 kilometers away from the modern coastline. Between the years 2007 and 2014, an international team under the direction of Aurea excavated and explored heretofore unknown periods within this region. At first, unrecognizable from the surface, the settlement mound was opened and investigated in several excavation trenches. Large parts of the prehistoric settlements apparently were leveled and destroyed for the construction of the modern fruit plantation. Some fruit trees even stand in Neolithic houses. Nevertheless, the architecture and material culture of the prehistoric inhabitants has been preserved for millennia. Different periods came to light within the excavated trenches. Settlements of the Neolithic, the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age form an archive that can be evaluated, researched and analyzed with modern interdisciplinary methods. A team of archaeologists studied the excavated remains in close cooperation. These breakthrough results were included in the UNESCO World Heritage 2015. Large parts of the prehistoric settlements apparently were leveled and destroyed for the construction of the modern fruit plantation. Nevertheless, the architecture and material culture of the prehistoric inhabitants has been preserved for millennia. Different periods came to light within the excavated trenches. The story of the mound begins in the Neolithic, around 8,700 years ago. Massive cultural layers indicate the continuous settlement of the mound for a period of around 800 years in the Neolithic. Çukuriçi Höyük was originally located close to a sea lagoon. Even though it is uncertain whether mobile groups of hunters and gatherers used the lagoon for habitation, we assume that the first settlers came via the sea. These people brought an entire package of maritime know-how with them, what can be inferred from specialized fishing techniques and the knowledge of navigation along specific sea routes. Although the means of transportation were not preserved, the usage of simple boats can be assumed. The basin, densely vegetated with oak, was laced with small streams and formed the perfect habitat for early farmers and stock breeders. In our excavations at the bottom of the mound, we found remains from the everyday life of people. Around 300 years later, the inhabitants erected houses with massive stone sockles, wooden posts and stamped mud walls. Many activities can be reconstructed based on the finds. These include weapons like sling missiles made of stone or clay, which were kept inside the settlement. A particular extraordinary find is the deposit of an obsidian cache found inside the building. This is not only unique in the Aegean, but also shows far-reaching connections of the inhabitants. The raw material originates in the Aegean island of Melos, 300 kilometers to the west. The technology and practice of long blade depots is mainly known from the Near East. Local potters produced thin-walled vessels of very high quality, mainly used for storing or consuming food. As the remains of a tuna fillet found on a floor proves, fish was commonly on the menu. Tilling the fields, husbandry of cattle, sheep, goats and pigs, as well as fishing, played an important role in everyday life. Raw material acquisition and sophisticated crafts possibly determined the daily routine of the inhabitants of Çukuriçi Höyük. rare depictions of humans, animals, and mysterious composite beings allow a little insight into a certainly versatile ritual or symbolic world. However, no matter if the ditch was used as fortification, settlement boundary, or enclosure, we can observe monumental construction in this period. After a short period, the ditch was filled up with tons of stones, probably in order to enlarge the settlement area. New structures built directly upon it were discovered below the early Bronze Age level. Many and varied forms of architecture and indications of textile production and metallurgical crafts were found in the settlement. A unique marble figurine is evidence that the inhabitants of the 4th millennium before Christ were incorporated in large-scale exchange networks. Residential and storage buildings, along with a desiccation platform, indicate intensive agriculture. As a result of wide-ranging contacts and specialized crafts, the foundation for the proto-urban settlement of the 3rd millennium before Christ was already set up in this time. From 3000 before Christ onwards, with the beginning of the Bronze Age, the tell was covered with buildings standing shoulder to shoulder. Multi-roomed buildings, open areas and passageways testify about intensive use of these areas. About 50 ovens and a multitude of metallurgical finds indicate the metallurgical center Çukuriçi Höyük. Pottery finds, including jugs and storage vessels, as well as objects made of antlers, and the metallurgical finds allow an insight in everyday life of specialized craftsmen. Besides objects for personal needs, products intended for trade were also produced inside the workshops. Additionally, ovens and hearths were used for cooking and warming up the food. Further craft activities such as processing bones or leather also took place within these rooms. Another important role within the Bronze Age settlement, alongside hunting and agriculture, was maritime fishing. Preparing mussels was already very popular at this time, indicated by pits filled with seashells. Another important part of the settlement's economy is presented by textile production. Numerous artifacts such as spindle whorls and loom weights were found in the settlement. Weaving looms within the rooms indicate specialization in this handicraft range. Therefore, the early Bronze Age settlement can be seen as a place with many diverse activities. First and foremost, this settlement is a metallurgical center producing copper and bronze objects. Beside these specialists, textile craftsmen, fishermen and smallholders were amongst the inhabitants. Stock farming was possibly conducted by other groups outside the center. The specialization and division of labor point to early proto-urban structures around 5,000 years ago. Our story, which started around 9,000 years ago, ended up with this center almost 4,000 years later. The continuation of the story about inhabitants of Çukuriçi Höyük remains temporarily uncertain and requires further archaeological research.